The night had settled softly over the village, with stars glittering across the vast African sky like scattered beads of light. The air carried the faint smell of wood smoke and roasted maize, a reminder that the day's work was done and the people had gathered, as they always did, near the great fire at the center of the square. Children sat cross-legged on the packed earth, their eyes gleaming with curiosity and expectation, while the elders leaned against carved stools, their arms crossed in anticipation of the evening's entertainment. In the heart of this circle, where the fire crackled and sparks rose into the darkness, stood the old storyteller. His back was bent, his hands weathered from years of toil, and his wrinkled face carried lines deeper than the riverbeds after the rains. Yet in those tired eyes lingered a glow, something between wisdom and sorrow, as though he carried not just stories but the weight of 1,000 generations. He leaned on a carved wooden staff, its top polished smooth from decades of use, and when he began to speak, his voice trembled like a branch in the wind. It was not the booming authority of the young warriors, nor the honeyed laughter of the women. It was a slow, deliberate voice, heavy with meaning and yet fragile, as though it might disappear at any moment. For a brief instant, the fire seemed to hush, and the night leaned closer to listen. But before his words could weave their way into the air, the laughter began. A young man, bold from youth and arrogance, smirked and shouted, "Does he not tire us with the same old tales? These stories are for children, not grown men who have fields to plow and trade to pursue." Another joined in, slapping his thigh as he chuckled, "Yes, let him tell the jackal stories again, perhaps the children will clap, but we have no need for such foolishness." The crowd rippled with amusement, and soon the firelight was filled with laughter louder than the crickets in the grass. The old man paused. His thin lips pressed together, his eyes cast downward for a moment, as though each laugh pierced him like a thorn. Yet when he raised his head he did not scowl or curse them. Instead he smiled, a soft, patient smile as though he had heard it all before. He began to speak again, and though some turned away, his words drifted into the circle like smoke from the fire. "You think stories are only for children," he said slowly, "but stories are the roots of a tree. Without them the tree falls. Without them the village forgets who it is." The villagers scoffed. A woman whispered to her neighbor, shaking her head, "Always with his riddles. Always with his warnings. What use are words when there is land to till and mouths to feed?" A boy, trying to mimic the grown men, clapped mockingly and shouted, "Grandfather, tell us how the moon fell into the river again." His friends erupted in laughter, their teeth flashing white in the firelight. Still the storyteller's voice did not falter. His staff tapped gently on the earth with each word, a rhythm that seemed to echo from deep within the ground itself. "You laugh," he said softly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "but laughter does not change truth. One day when the river rises and the wind howls, you will remember these words. You will wish you had listened." A hush crept into the air for a heartbeat, as though even the fire itself considered his warning. But then another peal of laughter broke the silence and the spell was gone. The villagers shook their heads, dismissing him as an old man clinging to fading relevance. Yet the children, though they giggled with the others, could not shake the image of his glowing eyes and the calm smile that lingered even in the face of mockery. It was a smile that hinted at secrets the rest could not yet see, a smile that said the truth does not need applause, it only waits for its time. The fire burned brighter as the old storyteller shifted his weight on the staff and lifted his head toward the circle of faces, many smirking, some indifferent, and only a handful curious. His voice carried slowly, weaving its way into the crackling of wood and the distant cries of night birds. "Long ago," he began, "our ancestors were warned of a time when the river would no longer listen to the people. The waters, calm and loyal, would swell with anger and swallow the land. It was not rain alone that caused it, but the hearts of men, their greed, their betrayal, their refusal to listen to the wisdom given freely." Some of the villagers groaned. A man at the back shouted, "Here it is again, the curses, the disasters. Always gloom from this old tongue." The crowd laughed, and the storyteller's words trembled for a moment in the air, nearly drowned by the noise. But he did not stop. His thin hands tightened on his staff, his eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and his voice deepened with determination. "The flood will come," he continued, ignoring their jeers. "The river will rise higher than the tallest hut, faster than the swiftest goat. It will wash away the fields, the animals, and even the songs of this village unless you prepare. But worse than the water will be the betrayal among you. A man of your own blood, blinded by greed, will open the door to ruin. His hands will welcome the outsiders and his tongue will sell you like cattle. And yet, His voice softened, and he glanced toward the children sitting close to the fire, their faces pale with awe. Yet there will be one among you, a hidden hero who no one believes in now. When all hope is gone, that soul will rise, and by remembering these words, will lead you to safety. A ripple of nervous laughter broke the silence. A young warrior slapped his knee and called out, "So now we will all drown? And our neighbor will betray us? And a child will save us? Ah, these are tales for weak hearts, not strong men." His companions echoed his laughter, clapping each other on the back as if courage lived only in mockery. A woman, clutching a baby to her chest, shook her head with irritation. Why must he fill the children's minds with fear? Is life not already hard enough? We plant, we sweat, we bleed. And now he wants us to tremble at invisible floods and invisible traitors. Another man shouted, "Old one, you bring misfortune with your tongue. Keep such talk to yourself, or else you'll call disaster upon us with your curses." The crowd roared with approval, their voices rising like a tide of derision. But the children, oh, the children leaned closer. Their small hands rested on their knees, their eyes wide and unblinking. They did not hear curses. They did not hear foolishness. They heard secrets. They heard warnings. They heard a mystery that wrapped itself around their hearts like vines climbing a tree. One little boy, no more than 8, whispered to the girl beside him, "Do you think it's true? Could the river really grow angry?" She nodded solemnly, though her lips trembled. "He never tells lies. My mother says he speaks of things no one else dares to." The storyteller's voice lowered, pulling the children deeper into the net of his tale. "The flood will not come tomorrow nor the day after. It will wait. The sky will grow heavy, the earth will groan, and when you see the river moving faster than the wind, you will know. And remember this, laughter cannot stop the water and doubt cannot silence truth." But the laughter swelled again, mocking, cruel, unstoppable. Someone threw a pebble at the ground near his feet. Another mimicked his voice, dragging out his words in a ridiculous tone that sent the crowd into another fit of giggles. The old man did not flinch. His eyes wandered past them all, settling on the darkness beyond the fire, as if he already saw the waters creeping toward them. The ridicule grew until even some of the children tried to join in, embarrassed to be caught listening so intently. Yet in their hearts, the words stayed. They felt heavy, carved deep into their memory, impossible to erase. Finally, when the noise became unbearable, the storyteller raised his staff and struck the earth 3 times. The sound echoed like a drumbeat, demanding silence. For a brief moment, even the loudest fell quiet. His voice rose again, firm despite its trembling timbre. "Laugh as you will, but when the river swallows your homes, when betrayal breaks your trust, and when a forgotten one leads you to life, you will remember this night. You will remember my words. And then you will no longer laugh." His words hung heavy in the night air, thick as smoke, yet one by one the villagers shook off the unease and returned to their scorn. The fire popped loudly, a spark leaping into the sky, and the crowd's laughter returned, though weaker this time, forced as if part of them feared the very thing they mocked. But the children stayed quiet, their eyes wide, their hearts restless. They had glimpsed something their elders had missed, a shadow of truth hidden inside the old man's trembling words. And though they dared not say it aloud, they believed him. When the fire had burned low and the villagers returned to their huts, it was the children who carried the storyteller's words with them. Their voices, hushed and trembling with excitement, passed the tale from ear to ear like a secret too dangerous to share with adults. In the quiet corners of the village, behind reed fences and beneath the wide branches of trees, they whispered about the flood, about betrayal, about the hidden hero who would one day save them. At first it was only a game. They repeated his warnings in playful tones, daring one another to act out the flood as though it were a story for amusement. One boy puffed his cheeks and rushed forward like a wave, while the others squealed and scattered, pretending to be swept away. A girl stood on a stone and shouted that she was the hero, laughing as she led the others to the safety of a patch of dry ground. Their laughter filled the night air, but beneath the playfulness was a seed, a shadow of belief that none could quite shake. As the days passed, they began to notice things they had never paid attention to before. The river, which usually moved with a steady rhythm, now seemed restless. Its current tugged harder at the banks, pulling at the reeds until their roots were exposed. Fishermen grumbled that their nets tangled more easily, that the water was too high for the season. The children, listening carefully, exchanged glances that spoke of the storyteller's warnings. The sky too seemed different. Clouds gathered strangely, thick and gray even when the air was hot and heavy. The wind sometimes carried an unfamiliar chill, whispering through the grass as if it carried secrets no one wanted to hear. And in the evenings, when adults thought the children were busy chasing each other in play, the little ones overheard the elders muttering in low voices. They spoke of strange traders passing through the nearby lands, of deals being whispered between chiefs, of unease creeping into the hearts of neighboring villages. The words were never spoken openly, but the children caught fragments like scattered seeds, enough to water the doubts that had begun to sprout inside them. One evening, sitting under the broad shadow of the baobab tree, a girl asked softly, "Do you think the flood will really come?" The others fell silent, staring at the ground. Finally, one boy nodded, his face serious in a way no child's face should be. "The river is already angry. I can hear it at night. It moves too fast. It sounds like it's breathing." Another added, almost in a whisper, "And my father said the chief spends too much time with the strangers. He said they bring him gifts, but I saw the look in his eyes. It was not a good look." Their voices trembled, but the more they whispered, the more the doubts grew. What had once been laughter at an old man's warnings now became restless questions that clung to them even in their dreams. And though they tried to push the thoughts away, the words of the storyteller rang again and again in their hearts. Laughter cannot stop the water, and doubt cannot silence truth. The days stretched into weeks, and the village began to feel a shift that no one could deny. At first it was the river. It had always been their companion, flowing faithfully along its course, providing fish, water for their crops, and a place for children to cool their feet in the heat of the afternoon. But now it seemed different, restless, as if something stirred within it. The water swelled higher along its banks than anyone could remember for that season. The reeds that lined its edges bent and shivered in the current, their roots clawing desperately into the soil. Women washing clothes found themselves stepping back further each day, their skirts dampened by a waterline that seemed to creep forward with silent determination. Fishermen muttered as their canoes rocked dangerously in currents too strong for the season. They shook their heads, blaming strange winds or the anger of forgotten spirits, but deep in their eyes flickered unease. Then came the travelers. Traders passed through the dusty roads with their donkeys laden with salt, cloth, and stories. Their words carried whispers of unrest. Villages where chiefs quarreled over land, where strangers from distant places came seeking power, where promises of wealth split neighbors into enemies. Around the fire, these traders spoke cautiously, glancing over their shoulders as though even the night might betray them. "The world is shifting," one man said, his face half hidden in the glow of the flames. "Greed spreads faster than fire on dry grass." His words left behind a heaviness that clung to the villagers long after the traders had gone. It was no secret that their own chief had begun to act strangely. Once he had walked among the people with pride and laughter, joining them in hunts and harvest celebrations. But lately he withdrew, his face shadowed with secrecy, his eyes sharp with calculation. Outsiders came to meet him, men dressed in fine fabrics carrying gifts of beads, metal, and strange bottles of drink that made the chief's tongue loosen. He welcomed them into his hut, and when they left, the chief's hands gleamed with treasures, but his eyes no longer held the warmth of one who served his people. Rumors spread like dry leaves in the wind. Some said he had promised land to the strangers. Others swore he had agreed to sell grain stores meant for the village. None knew the full truth, but all felt the tremor of betrayal brewing in the shadows. The villagers began to argue. At the water's edge, voices rose in quarrels about whether the river's strange swelling was natural or a sign. Some declared it was nothing more than a passing season. "The rains are not yet here," they scoffed. "Why do you worry about what has not happened?" Others lowered their voices and exchanged uneasy glances. "Do you not remember the storyteller's words?" they asked. "Did he not speak of the river rising? Did he not warn us of betrayal among our own?" The arguments carried into the market square. Women with baskets balanced on their heads shook their heads at one another, whispering that perhaps the old man's warnings were not so foolish after all. Men sharpening hoes paused to mutter that while they had laughed before, they now found themselves uneasy. Children, who had listened most carefully, repeated the words of the tale with a strange seriousness that unsettled their parents. Yet still many laughed. "Old men see doom in every shadow," one villager declared boldly. "If we lived by every tale we would never know peace." Another added, "It is not prophecy that makes the river rise, it is nature. Only fools and children give weight to an old man's ramblings." Their words rang with confidence, but their hands trembled slightly as they spoke. Through it all, the old storyteller remained silent. He sat in his usual place near the fire, his staff resting across his lap, his face calm and unreadable. He no longer tried to force his words into ears that refused to listen. His silence was heavier than his voice had ever been, as though he knew time itself would soon prove him right. Sometimes children approached him, their eyes wide with fear, asking softly if the danger was near. He would only smile, placing a hand gently on their heads and say, "The river will speak for itself. Watch and you will know." And so the village lived in uneasy tension. The river crept higher. The trader's warnings echoed in their minds. The chief's dealings grew darker, his laughter too loud, too false, when he reassured his people that nothing was amiss. The villagers quarreled and gossiped, torn between disbelief and fear. And the old man, mocked, dismissed, yet never forgotten, sat like a shadow at the edge of their lives, his silence pressing on them more than words ever could. The first signs of betrayal came quietly, almost unnoticed. A group of outsiders arrived one morning, their donkeys laden with goods finer than anything the villagers had ever seen, bright fabrics that shimmered like the wings of birds, knives with blades sharp enough to slice through bark with a single stroke, bottles of drink that glittered in the sunlight. They did not come to trade as ordinary travelers did. Instead, they went directly to the chief's hut, where they were welcomed with feasts and laughter. 4 days they sat together behind closed doors, voices low but filled with eagerness, while the rest of the village watched uneasily from a distance. When the men left, the chief emerged with treasures in his hands and an unnatural gleam in his eyes. His smile was wide, but it did not reach the corners of his face. Soon after, word spread. The chief had promised a portion of the fertile land along the river to the outsiders. They would farm it, he said, and bring prosperity. He spoke of new wealth, new trade, and better futures. He promised that the village would be stronger than ever before. But not everyone believed his words. Farmers who had worked that land for generations cried out in protest. "Those fields are the heart of our harvest," they argued. "Without them, our children will go hungry." Mothers whispered in fear that their sons and daughters would one day be servants to strangers. Elders shook their heads, remembering the storyteller's warning. Betrayal would come from one of their own, a man blinded by greed who would sell them to outsiders. Still, the chief silenced the complaints with gifts. To some he gave beads, to others coins of metal. He held feasts, slaughtering goats and pouring drink so freely that many forgot their anger, at least for a night. "Do you not see?" he declared before the crowd, raising a cup high. "The outsiders are our friends. They bring us wealth and strength. Do not cling to old ways when new ways will make us greater." His words were met with forced cheers, though many eyes were filled with doubt. The outsiders returned with workers and tools, and soon the fertile fields were fenced. Villagers who once planted millet and maize there were driven out, forced to search for smaller plots on poorer soil. Tension spread like wildfire. Families quarreled with one another, accusing neighbors of siding with the chief, of accepting bribes, of betraying their people for trinkets. Where once there had been unity, now there were cracks, wide, jagged, and growing deeper with each passing day. Children whispered more urgently than ever. "This is what he meant," they told each other, thinking of the old storyteller. "The betrayal has begun. The land is gone. The flood will be next." Some of them tugged at their mothers' skirts, begging them to listen, but the women only hushed them, too afraid to admit that the children might be right. Meanwhile, the storyteller sat silently at the edge of the fire gatherings, his staff resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the chief with a gaze that cut sharper than any blade. He did not speak, not even when asked directly for his thoughts. His silence spoke louder than words, and many found it more frightening than his stories. For in his stillness was the weight of truth, heavy and undeniable. And so the village, once bound together by kinship and trust, now stood divided. Some praised the chief and his new friends, eager for wealth. Others seethed in anger at what had been stolen from them. And all the while, the storyteller's prophecy echoed like a drumbeat in their minds. Betrayal would come from within, and it would open the door to ruin. The first raindrops fell softly, tapping against the thatched roofs like playful fingers. No one thought much of it. Rain was common enough, even welcome after days of oppressive heat. But as night deepened, the sky split open with a sound like the earth itself had cracked, and the heavens began to pour without mercy. Sheets of water fell, blinding and relentless, drumming against the huts, filling clay pots faster than they could be emptied. Lightning tore across the sky in jagged flashes, illuminating faces pressed nervously against doorways. Children clung to their mothers, eyes wide as thunder rolled like 1,000 drums. By morning the storm had not ceased. The river, swollen and furious, surged against its banks with a violence no one had ever seen. The calm companion of their lives had become a roaring beast, tearing at the soil, dragging entire clumps of earth into its churning body. The reeds that once swayed gently now disappeared beneath waves. Canoes were tossed aside like toys, splintering against rocks. Fishermen who ventured near the water's edge shouted in alarm, retreating as the river clawed further onto the land. Soon the flood spilled into the fields. Crops that had been nurtured with care, the lifeblood of the village, bent and snapped under the weight of the rushing water. Green stalks vanished beneath the muddy torrent, carried away as if they had never existed. Goats bleated in panic, chickens flapped wildly from their coops, and cattle bellowed as they were dragged by the current, their hooves thrashing uselessly against the force of the river. The storm grew wilder still. Winds howled through the village, ripping leaves from the trees, lifting roofs from huts and scattering them like dry grass. Families huddled together, clutching one another as the water crept closer. Then without warning the river broke through completely. Its banks collapsed in a thunderous roar, and a wall of water surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. Screams tore through the village. Men shouted for their wives, women cried for their children, and children cried for anyone who would take their hand. Families were split apart as the water forced its way between them. Mothers clutched babies above their heads, their legs struggling against the current. Fathers tried to carry elders on their backs, stumbling as the water pulled at their knees. Neighbors who once shared laughter now fought desperately for survival, pushing against each other in the chaos. Huts crumbled, swept away as though made of straw. The fire pit, once the heart of the village, hissed and vanished under the surge, sending smoke spiraling into the rain-filled air. The great baobab tree, ancient and steadfast, shook under the storm's fury, its roots holding fast even as smaller trees were ripped from the earth. In the madness, voices rose in terrified realization. The storyteller. "He warned us of this," shouted a woman, clutching her child against her chest as the water climbed higher. A man cried out, "He spoke of the river. He told us it would rise." Another, his voice breaking with despair, shouted above the roar, "And he said betrayal would open the door. The chief, he has sold us to ruin." The words of the old man echoed in every heart, remembered with sudden clarity. The river will rise higher than the tallest hut. Laughter cannot stop the water. Doubt cannot silence truth. The villagers, who once jeered at his trembling voice, now found his words pounding inside their minds louder than the storm itself. But remembrance came too late. No amount of belief now could push back the raging flood. Panic consumed them. People scrambled toward higher ground, slipping in the mud, clutching at branches, dragging their loved ones through the water. Some did not make it, swept away before they could even cry out. Others stood frozen in terror until neighbors pulled them forward, urging them to move before the river devoured them. Through the chaos, the chief's hut collapsed in a rush of water and mud, his treasures spilling out and vanishing beneath the flood. The same gifts he had boasted of, the beads, the metal, the shining bottles, floated uselessly, mocking his greed. He shouted orders desperately, but his voice was drowned by the storm. The very people he had betrayed no longer looked to him for guidance. His power was nothing against the river's fury. Children screamed for their parents and parents screamed for their children. Families were torn apart, some carried downstream with only the desperate hope of being reunited. Livestock bleated in agony, swept into the current, their cries mixing with human voices until the flood became a chorus of loss. The old storyteller stood on higher ground, his staff planted firmly in the mud, watching as the prophecy unfolded. He did not shout or weep, though his eyes glistened with sorrow. He had tried to warn them, had spoken until his voice cracked, and still they had laughed. Now, as the waters swallowed everything they had built, his calm gaze seemed both haunting and merciful. Some villagers, catching sight of him, cried out for forgiveness, their voices raw with desperation. Others reached toward him, as though his presence alone might hold back the flood. But the old man simply shook his head, whispering words lost to the storm. His silence was not cruelty, but mourning. He had always known that stories could not force belief, they could only wait until truth revealed itself. The flood raged through the night, a merciless tide that spared neither rich nor poor, neither young nor old. By dawn the storm had softened, but the village lay in ruins. Homes were gone, fields destroyed, animals scattered or drowned. The people, soaked and trembling, gathered on what little high ground remained. Their eyes were wide, their bodies shivering, not only from cold, but from the realization that every word the storyteller had spoken had come true. No one laughed now. The sound of laughter felt impossible in a world where truth had arrived like a roaring flood. The rain still fell, though softer now, as if the heavens themselves were exhausted from weeping. All around the village lay broken. Huts were flattened, fields were nothing but a brown ocean, and the cries of the living mingled with the silence of those who had been carried away. Families huddled together on what scraps of high ground they could find, shivering, hopeless, and afraid. It was then that a small voice rose above the despair. "Come with me." Heads turned. Standing on a fallen log was Cato, the orphan boy. His clothes were torn, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his eyes burned with a strange light. This was the same child who had sat at the old storyteller's feet night after night, listening when others mocked, memorizing every word. While the storm had scattered the wisdom of the elder from the minds of most, Cato carried it like fire in his chest. "The storyteller said the hill of ancestors is where we would be safe," he shouted, his small arms waving toward the distant rise beyond the flooded fields. "It is the only place the river cannot swallow. If we go now we will live." At first the villagers only stared. Some muttered angrily, their grief too heavy for hope. Others shook their heads, unwilling to trust the voice of a child when even the chief's strength had crumbled. The flood had stripped them of certainty, leaving only fear. But Cato did not falter. He leapt down from the log and waded into the muddy water, turning back only to cry again, "Follow me if you want to see tomorrow." An old woman, clutching the hand of her trembling granddaughter, stepped forward. "I heard the same words," she whispered. "The elder spoke of that hill. The boy remembers truly." Slowly she began to follow him. Others looked at one another, torn between doubt and desperation. The river roared behind them, and in that sound they heard the end of all things. One by one families began to rise. Mothers lifted their children, fathers carried the weak, and soon a trickle of people moved behind the boy. What began as reluctance turned into urgency. Feet splashed through the water, voices called out for loved ones, and the trickle became a flood of bodies pushing toward the only hope left. Cato pressed forward, guiding them along paths he remembered from the storyteller's tales, routes that rose higher, away from the river's pull. Every step was a test, the ground slippery with mud, the current tugging at their legs. But the boy never slowed. He recited the words as if they were a song. "The hill of ancestors stands firm, where bones rest in peace and no flood dares to rise. Go there, children of tomorrow, and life will be yours." The villagers clung to those words as they stumbled after him. Each phrase seemed to carve strength into their weary hearts. Even the strongest men, who once dismissed both boy and elder, now listened with bowed heads, following a child as though he were their chief. Hours passed before the ground finally began to lift beneath their feet. The hill rose ahead, dark and solid against the gray sky. At its base lay the carved stones of their ancestors, weathered but unbroken. And above, the slope stretched upward, untouched by the flood. When at last they reached it, the people collapsed in exhaustion, tears of relief streaming down their faces. From this higher place they could see the devastation below, their homes drowned, their fields gone, but they could also see something greater. They were alive, bound together not by the command of a corrupt chief, but by the courage of a boy who believed. Cato stood at the front, chest heaving, rain dripping from his chin. The villagers looked at him in awe, and for the first time, no one saw an orphan. They saw a leader. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the roar of thunder. From the safety of the hill of ancestors, the survivors gazed down at what had once been their village. Where fields once rippled with golden crops, there was only water, stretching wide like an endless grave. The huts, the market, the meeting ground, all swallowed. Smoke rose faintly from broken roofs, drifting like a sigh of mourning into the gray sky. They were alive, yet their hearts were burdened with grief. Families clung to one another, counting blessings even as they counted losses. The chief, stripped of pride, sat alone, his riches washed away as surely as his words of promise. In the midst of sorrow, all eyes turned to the one figure who had long been ignored, ridiculed, even despised. The old storyteller stood with his staff, his wrinkled hands trembling slightly, though not from weakness but from the weight of what had come to pass. His tired eyes scanned the crowd, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost like a prayer carried on the breeze. "My children," he began, and the words silenced even the restless crying of babes. "You mocked me when I spoke. You laughed when I warned. You called my tales the ramblings of a mind too old to matter. Yet here you stand, alive, not because of your chief, not because of your wealth, but because of the story you once despised." The people bowed their heads. Shame burned in their hearts like a second flood. None dared to speak, for each remembered the nights they had jeered, the days they had dismissed him, the words they had tossed aside like dry leaves. The old man lifted his staff and tapped it gently against the stones of the hill. A story, he said slowly, is not just a tale for children. It is a warning wrapped in wisdom, a lantern carried through the darkness of time. When you ignore a story, you turn away from the light. And when the darkness comes, you stumble. His gaze shifted toward Cato, the orphan boy, standing at the front of the crowd with mud still streaked across his small arms. This child listened. This child remembered. And because he carried the story in his heart, you were saved. Not by my voice, but by his courage to trust what others rejected. The villagers murmured, their shame now mixed with admiration for the boy. Tears filled the eyes of mothers, fathers, elders, and children alike. Some reached out their hands toward the storyteller, as if to touch the source of the wisdom they had once scorned. The old man's voice grew firmer, though never harsh. A story ignored is a life lesson lost. Remember this, for it is not the last storm you will face, not the last betrayal, not the last hardship. But if you hold fast to the lessons of our ancestors, if you teach your children to listen, then no flood, no fire, no enemy will ever truly destroy you. Silence followed, deep and heavy. Then, as though moved by a single spirit, the villagers bowed low before him. Not one stood proud, not even the chief. Their pride was broken, yet in that brokenness grew something new: reverence, respect, and the seed of humility. The old storyteller lowered his staff and smiled faintly. His face was weary, his body frail, but his words had outlived laughter and mockery. Now they had become truth, carved into the hearts of those who survived. And so, on the hill of ancestors, beneath the quiet sky, the man once ridiculed became the voice of wisdom, and the people vowed never again to treat a story as mere words. In the days that followed, the survivors began to rebuild, not just their homes but their hearts. At the center of their gratitude stood Cato, the orphan boy who had carried the storyteller's words like a torch through the storm. He was no longer seen as a child without family, no longer the boy who lingered at the edges of gatherings. He was celebrated as a hero, the one who had guided them to safety when even their leaders faltered. Mothers embraced him as though he were their own, and fathers placed hands on his shoulders, proud of the courage that had risen from his small frame. Yet Cato himself never claimed the honor. He bowed his head whenever praised, pointing always to the old man. "I only remembered what he told us," he would say. "It was his story that saved us, not me." The villagers turned then to the storyteller, their eyes no longer mocking but filled with reverence. But the old man, weary and frail, knew his journey was near its end. One night, as the fire crackled softly, he called for the people to gather. With Cato seated at his side, he gave them his final blessing. "My work is done," he whispered, his voice fading but still clear. "The stories now belong to you. Guard them well, for they are your shield, your guide, your memory." When dawn broke, the old man was gone, his staff resting beside him as though it too had laid down to sleep. The village mourned deeply, yet their sorrow was softened by the knowledge that he had left them not in silence, but with a legacy carved into their souls. From that day forward, the people treated every story with reverence. No tale was too small, no word too old. Around the fire, children listened with wide eyes, and elders spoke with care, knowing that wisdom could wear any face. The laughter that once mocked had been replaced by respect, for they had learned the cost of ignoring truth. And so the village carried the storyteller's memory like a flame. Laughter at wisdom, they realized, is short-lived. But truth lives forever.